Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read, so 7 books. The Long Form by Kate Briggs. For the Love of Singular Men by Victor Heringer, translated from the Spanish by... translated from the Portuguese by James Young. The Belan deck by Matt Bucher. Anxious Pleasures, a novel after Kafka by Olsen. Austral by Gabriel Fonseca, translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. It's a translator whose name crops up a lot with Spanish literature. Norwegian author Hanna Stoltenberg's Near Distance, and this was translated by Wendy H. Gabrielson. And finally, a bit of crime fiction, Trevor Mark Thomas, Dry Cleaning. So I'm going to start with The Long Form by Kate Briggs. So this is a novel come essay. I very much like Kate Zambreno's novel, which was also a sort of the experience of trying to write an academic essay when you have a newborn or a very young child to look after. And that's sort of how those two intersect, and you have to juggle this. And I enjoyed that. I gave that 5 stars. This takes it on to a whole another level. I thought it was absolutely fabulous. So the character Helen has a 6-week-old baby. She lives on her own, and the action of the book takes place in one day. And such action that it is you know, all the calls on her time in order to maintain the baby's welfare, feeding, warmth, changing nappies, getting some fresh air, trying to stimulate it with either a mobile or one of those sort of contact mats with all different sort of things in it. So on the one hand, seemingly very humdrum, very mundane, very ordinary, but she does something extremely sort of ambitious, and that she has ordered a copy of Henry Fielding's book Tom Jones, which I've never read, but is about, I assume, 700-800 pages. So she's going to attempt to tackle that book while she has a very, very newborn child. It's an incredibly ambitious thing to do. I know in my case, when we had twins, for the first 6 months I did no reading whatsoever, because it was all hands to the pump to maintain twins, and it was really any sort of crime novels, crime fiction, that got me back into the swing of reading at all. And the essay part of this is a sort of contemplation of the novel, because it's asking the question, and I think answering it very, very sort of definitively, that often men are said to write novels of action and big ideas, whereas women write domestic, small-scale stuff. And she puts an absolute knife through that, in that this is a book full of ideas. It's a book about the novel form and art, but it's a book about time and space and all the assumptions we have, particularly on time, and how that's shattered when one is entirely responsible for the rhythms, or to answer the rhythms of a newborn. That the newborn's rhythms control the adult rather than the other way around. So there's a lot of profundity in it, saying that, you know, a lot of what is dismissed as the women's realm and the mundane actually contain you know, wisdom that we as a species could really benefit from if only we listened to it, if only we hearkened to it. So, as I say, I've not read Tom Jones, but apparently Henry Fielding claimed it to be a new form of the novel, and appended the word novel to it, because previous to that all books were sort of categorised by genre, whether it was historical fiction or romantic fiction or whatever. And as part of this book, where he's writing about fictional characters, but he's very much calls himself a realist, in that although these characters never existed, the actions of their daily lives, as described in his novel, are utterly believable, that, you know, they would happen. That you know, there's no supernatural agency, that this is how people live. So he is a realist in that sense. But because he's sort of promoting and trumpeting this as a sort of a new style of fiction writing. There are essayistic parts within his own novel. It's a bit like Tristram Shandy in that sense. It sort of breaks, addresses the reader directly, and it breaks with, what's come before. He's laying out the rules of this new genre that he's created of the novel. So there are essayistic parts, and that is, I think, mirrored within this. The chapters are very short. She says that Helen says in the book that there's something like 206 or 203 chapters in Tom Jones. I wouldn't be surprised if there was exactly 203 in here, in a deliberately sort of move of symmetry. There are essayistic parts in this, like there are in Fielding's, but I just thought this was an absolutely superb, engrossing treatment of, the act of bringing up or of rearing a small child, helpless child, and trying to establish both mutuality to so that Helen is tuned into the rhythms of the child, and yet to give it the space of being an other, of being independent being with its own needs and things like that, to give it the space, which personally I think is the trick to all child rearing. Is not to try and make them a clone or to be a repository of the parents' dreams and ambitions, but to give the child their own genuine independent space to flourish and become the person who they were always going to be. D.W. Winnicott, who is a child psychologist that I've studied when I was at university, is featured in this, and Winnicott was one, along with Melanie Klein, who was more on the psychoanalytical side, but they both sort of talked about how space is different for men and women, in the sense that women can have something different, something other inside themselves when they're pregnant, in a way that men never can, and that can lead to a completely different conceptualization and approach to space. The space of her little house, or flat rather, in here is sort of absolutely sort of crucially and forensically sort of plotted out, because in a way a lot of her time she's pacing around this room with her child, trying to stimulate it, what's outside the window, the change of light during the day, all these things she's trying to modulate for her daughter. And as I say, so on the one hand you have all this wonderfully sort of lyrical, poetic, but profound stuff about these two beings, one of whom is entirely dependent on the other, and yet also still has an independency of mind, an independency of feeling and emotion. So you have that on the one side, but then you have all the big idea stuff about how that approximates to the novel, particularly the novel Tom Jones. Tom Jones himself was a foundling, i.e. an abandoned baby. So at the same starting point of that novel was the same starting point for Helen, virtually. So I can't recommend this book highly enough. So just to give you a couple of things. So talking about the importance of names in novels, you get the sense of a character through what their name is. And really it's the same thing for, when you're naming babies, choose names. What was her name, his name, their name? Do they have hair? Can you describe it? The colour, the texture. Had there been changes? Did they cut it recently? Will she lose it? A name plus hair, it sounds too simple. But if a person were to know these things about someone else, real or imagined, what else would they know? What could they surmise or invent? Possibly enough. Enough at least to start marking out a space, the contours of a place for a new person to occupy in which their character might appear. So you can see how that resonates between, you're a newborn baby and starting to, you name it very quickly within its life, and how that starts to unfold as it starts to inhabit a space of its own, and how the name sort of frames and encapsulates that. But also within a novel, how a fictional character occupies the space in the novel, partly introduced by their name. So there's a lot of resonances between, the art of the novel and real life. And again, this sort of domestic, supposedly insignificant, commonplace, no, not at all. It's absolutely deeply profound. If you had a better understanding of the other, in this case of a baby, perhaps we wouldn't sort of violate our planet. Perhaps we wouldn't have so many wars and conflicts over social media and argument. You know, we'd be more aware of otherness and more sympathetic to it. I mean, what greater profundity would you like to have? You know, knowledge about human beings at the start of life when they're sort of a clean slate, they haven't been imprinted upon, you know, which is treated as I say, small and domestic and not very important, whereas actually it's the beginning of life, it's the beginning of our lives, it's the most important thing, which of course we can't access because we don't have those sort of synapses and neurons in place, but they can be observed in another as a mother to her child. So you can either have that or a piece of mail writing about the forensics of an office stapler or air conditioning systems such as you get with Nicholson Baker's the mezzanine, which is also very small scale, very humdrum everyday life. Which would you rather have knowledge of? A baby and its accessibility, or a stapler? So this is about the different nature of time for a newborn parent. She said, the point is, I know time. I know time differently now. I know it because I am unlearning it. It is not a knowledge particular to me. I know it because the baby is teaching me that the rhythms of the clock and the calendar, and even the most elemental diurnal patterns, they don't go without saying. They are acquired, if not violently imposed. It is a lived and not an abstract form of knowledge that comes from living alongside a beginner. The way the days can all of a sudden feel like they're undivided, divided by nothing, only water. So 5 stars, terrific. And on to The Love of Singular Men by Victor Heringer, who is Brazilian. Was Brazilian. Unfortunately, he committed suicide at age 30. So this is a book about a young boy in Brazil who has a condition where he doesn't have much strength in his legs, so he spends most of his time on crutches. And his family take in a street boy, and initially the boy on crutches is not happy about this because he thinks his parents are trying to sort of find a fully abled boy to sort of replace him in their psyche as a sort of, you know, healthy son. But also he's afraid that this boy will hit on his sister and break up their close relationship. But far from it. And eventually the two boys form a relationship as teenagers, a sexual relationship. And unfortunately the fully able boy is murdered just 2 weeks after they have their first sexual encounter with one another. And that's basically the story of the book. What I really liked about it is it's the charming nature of the voice. You know, a lot of books from the perspective of a child don't work, usually because the literary language in which a book is written is actually above what you'd expect out of the mouth of a child. That never entered the equation here. The voice was so charming that I was really happy to be escorted through the world of sort of Brazilian youth, you know, hot days in the summer, playing football, having a circle jerk, a group circle jerk, all these things. It was just really pleasingly detailed, as I say, through this voice. There is also the voice of the boy once he's grown into a man, and he's obviously never quite got over the death of his sort of stepbrother. But he himself also, as an adult, also adopts a street kid, and is trying to sort of better the prospects of this kid. And clearly, it's a sort of a replacement, really, for the child that was never allowed to develop into an adult through being murdered. And even that is done with sort of great sort of dignity and great love, really. As I say, I just found this book utterly charming. 4 stars. And on to The Belan Deck by Matt Bucher, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. Now, this was sent to me by the author, and that arrangement was made through a mutual contact of both of ours, who said that this would be right up my street, and indeed it is. It's a mixture of some of the best features, I feel, of Jared Kobeck and David Markson. So the main character here, he is charged with working up a PowerPoint presentation on AI in the workplace, and his job sort of apparently will hang on the success of this. And he is travelling back to his home in the airport at San Francisco. Unfortunately, there's sort of massive delays, so he's sort of idly sort of taking his surroundings, all the people around him, but also he's trying to come up mainly with a name, getting back to names like in the long form, trying to come up with a name for this PowerPoint presentation. So most of the slides are in place, so he is still adding some, but he knows the name is crucial, and he's sort of swinging between dry technical names about AI and machine learning versus more poetic names, names with soul, with spirit in them, and that's sort of the heart of this book, which is a battle between the soulless, the mechanical, the capitalist, and the artist, and the spiritual, and the poetic. I say David Markson is one of the people that he's channeling here, is because it's quite almost epigrammatic in style. It's very punchy, very rhythmic. It drives you through its narrative in a way that PowerPoint presentations don't. Good books make you want to turn the page. They're called page turners. A PowerPoint will never make you want to will never be a page turner, even though obviously the person delivering the PowerPoint is turning over the page by clicking onto the next slide. And he's talking about how, you know, books give you the chance of, you know, lasting through time, of being read in the future, whereas a PowerPoint, no one's going to read a PowerPoint outside of the presentation. It's very much in the now. It is sort of one-dimensional, one-off event. So as I say, there's sort of quite epigrammatic, and in a David Markson way, it's sort of throwing in sort of facts about AI, but also about his own personal family history, because Belan is his surname, and Belan is his family name, but his has been changed, and his boss is also called Belan, and he says to the boss, you know, we must be part of the same family somehow distantly. And the boss, who is more like a machine himself, dismisses it out of hand. He's not interested. This is, you know, frivolous to him. So there's sort of family history, there's meditations, but very brief because it's epigrammatic, meditations on AI versus art. That's why I say there's sort of Jared Kobeck because it's very funny in places, and I'll just read some of the good jokes, or what I feel are good jokes. So of the sort of fears of AI sort of wiping out the world in sort of true Skynet Terminator style, raise your algorithm right and it probably won't try to murder anyone. A chicken is only the method an egg uses to make another egg, which sort of turns logic on its head but makes a point about perspective, I feel. So just to give you an example of how it reads, so this is one page. AI, AI, AI. I have AI on the brain because of this stupid job. AI, way. AI is also a three-toed sloth. I learned that in first grade because I read the dictionary starting at A. The deck is a utilitarian format. It is not meant for art or literature. Edward Tufte claimed that PowerPoint, quote, routinely disrupts, dominates and trivialises content, and much worse. We trivialise virtually everything meaningful to humans in a market economy. Life is transmuted into trivia, bullets, rows. And then to start the next page, it's about his family history. So I love the way that this sort of almost represented a mind, the way our minds work and how thoughts flash through and link to our, are associated with other thoughts, and that leads us down rabbit holes. And of course, the notion of rabbit holes in, when you go online and stuff is expressly challenged here. I showed Belan an early draft of the deck, maybe 90 slides, and he said, it's trying to get at something important, but it's not there. I don't like all these little bits of unconnected trivia. Now that's the point in here. The trivia is absolutely connected because it's one mind. It's not algorithms and, you know, sort of collective sort of sifting of knowledge to produce the answer. This is one mind of the writer and of his protagonist producing all these associations, spinning off, firing in all different directions. And in a way, this is a PowerPoint summary of the character in the book. That this whole book is a window into his mind and some of the, as I say, the rabbit holes he disappears down, the way his thoughts drag him into associated thoughts, some historical, some sort of pontificating on ideas. I just thought it was brilliant. Great fun, funny, you know, punchy, and it rhythmically, it just drives you through it. 5 stars. And on to Lance Olsen, Anxious Pleasures, a novel after Kafka. This is the least successful Olsen novel I've read. I think I've read 4 now. But having said that, it's still absolutely immaculately written. But the problem for me is Kafka's my favourite author. I've read loads of his and about him and around him. So just to give you an idea. Is that Kafka, which is 99 Questions About Kafka by one of his most eminent biographers, Rainer Strack. Gustav Janusz, Conversations with Kafka. So this is a guy who actually knew Kafka very well and hung out with him a lot. And these are him writing up his impressions. A great biography by Pietro Citati called, I think it's just called Kafka. And then various, you know, the lost writings of Kafka, which was only published a couple of years ago. And then, you know, his actual long published classic output. So I'm a Kafka maven. I love him. I know a lot about him. And that sort of, unfortunately, somewhat eroded my experience of this. It's based around metamorphosis. It looks at the reactions of the family, the dad, the sister, the mother. We don't get much about Gregor Samsa the bug himself, unlike in Metamorphosis. It's more the people around him. So it'll be the cook, it will be the maidservant, it will be the lodgers that they take in to make up for the lost income of the son not being able to work. There's also a character in modern day London who's reading Metamorphosis and attending a book club, and she reads the academic essays in the back of her edition of Metamorphosis. So there's sort of lots of characters spinning off around it, but I couldn't see what it added to the original. I really couldn't, and that was my problem really. Even though it does sort of call in rather sort of subtly, I thought, references to other of Kafka's work, such as The Hunger Artist, Report to the Assembly, The Great Wall of China, America. They're in there, and I think sort of Kafka aficionados would recognise them. But again, is he trying to give us an impression of Kafka, the man, through this sort of alternative take on Metamorphosis, which I think it feels very sketchy if he is. There is a writer character who we assume is Kafka in the flat underneath the Samsa's flat, and it's sort of interrupted by the noises and stuff going there. So I felt this was unsuccessful for me, whereas for someone who's not so au fait with Kafka, maybe they'd get a lot out of it. But then you'd think, well, read Metamorphosis. You don't have to read this. But, you know, it is Lance Olsen, it is immaculately written, and the father, who's the least sympathetic character really, but he does get the best lines in the same way that Hannibal Lecter does. The father regards himself as an Abraham with an Isaac not quite worth the sacrifice. That was a great line. And equally, God the Father is quite sure, is testing his family in order to make it stronger. The father very much doubts his family is up to the challenge. So, you know, great tone, but all in all, I couldn't really see the point for me of this book. But I gave it 4 stars because of the quality of the writing. And on to Austral by Carlos Fonseca, who is originally from Puerto Rico. And this novel starts off with a middle-aged American university academic who originally hails from Puerto Rico, who receives a postcard summoning him to northern Argentina, to an artist commune, where an old acquaintance of his, who was a writer, has died halfway through the final book of a tetralogy, and the person writing this postcard to him has said she specifically requested him to complete this fourth novel. Sorry, it's a very annoying hedge trimming going on outside. I hope you can hear me. So he and this woman went round Nicaragua during the Sandinista revolution and the counter-revolution that was funded by the CIA and supported by the El Salvadorians. The woman herself had been attracted there, and this is from the book, by punk, which must mean the Clash's album called Sandinista, in tribute to the Sandinista struggle. And she didn't really strike me as someone who'd be into punk. I wasn't quite sure that the timing, I couldn't quite work out the timing. Anyway, so they bummed around Nicaragua. She'd taken a camera with her and was sort of taking photographs, supposedly for a news agency, that she sort of managed to bum the air ticket off by saying she would provide this service. And she never delivers them up to be published. So it's almost a complete scam. But she from there on, she was going to remain forever itinerant. Whereas he, hailing from Puerto Rico, he'd landed a place at an American university and he was loath to give it up. So there's a parting of the ways where he, at the end of their Nicaragua trip, he says, oh, I have to go to take my place at university. And they never see each other again until he's summoned all these years later in the advent of her death. So he goes to northern Argentina, to this artist commune. And what we get there is a lot of the artists just basically telling their life stories and where that intersects with this dead woman. And there's a lot of storytelling, there's a lot of personal histories here, which makes it very jarring when he sort of comes out of these stories and actually tells you what's around them in the time of this book. By which I mean, if there's a sort of an artist, I'd say it's an artist commune, and there's this party going on, and the party consists, in terms of this book, of some artist chewing off the ear of our protagonists. But then it will stop as he goes outside, and we actually get the author describing, the scene outside. But it jars, because up till then you've just been sort of bombarded with all these sort of personal stories and stories from history. So just to give you an example of that, without putting down his cigarette, Acosta took out his phone and held it out to Julio to show him the image of one of the flowers. A beautiful bloom like a white rose, except that its petals were marked by small folds reminiscent of the aquatic beauty of sea anemones. It's not a real flower, Acosta clarified. It's just a close-up of an exotic fungus that grows on eucalyptus trees. A parasite? Asked Julio. Exactly. It grows as a parasite on transplanted trees. Thrilled by the unusual beauty of that false flower, Julio imagined just how exotic Juvenal Suarez must have found the figure von Mühlfeld cut against the backdrop of the Tigre River. Exotic but sublime, like one of those fungi cross-dressed as a flower that Acosta went on talking about now as he picked up the story of Guevara with his return to Europe. And then we're back into the story as related by this guy Acosta. I think that's really clumsy writing. So we've broken out of the story to describe this flower, and yet all of that is just an excuse to make this rather heavy-handed, I feel, simile of, the parasitic false flower reminds our protagonist of how, back in history, one person must have regarded another, like one of those fungi cross-dressed as a flower that Acosta went on talking. I just felt it was really heavy-handed, really clumsy. And as I say, you get these tones are really badly modulated between somebody going on a story about them or their history or whatever, and then you break out into the real time of the book, get a bit of description, then back into story. But I think even worse than that for me was this book is not as clever as it thinks it is. That basically it has lots of framing devices. So it talks about before the Nazis came to power, there was a movement for racial purity in Germany, and Nietzsche's sister and her husband went to Paraguay to form a colony of purebred Germans. And like a lot of these sort of exotic colonies, they succumbed to disease and death. And it's claimed, I don't know how true this is, that we know the Nazis shanghaied the works of Nietzsche on the Übermensch, the Superman, and all this sort of stuff to back up their sort of theories of racial superiority. Nietzsche himself was absolutely not anti-Semitic, was not proclaiming the Übermensch specifically over what the Nazis called degenerates of Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and all this sort of stuff. But it was his sister, i.e. the sister who went on to form this colony, when she came back after the disaster of her colony and her husband had died out there, that she was the one who basically manipulated Nietzsche, who by this time was in an insane asylum, and sort of turned his work into this sort of rabid sort of racialism that the Nazis then incorporate into their own theories. So we have this colony. Then we have an academic called von Muirfield, who's referred to in that section I read, who sort of like a sort of an archaeological dig sort of uncovers the fact of this colony and wants to go and rediscover its truth. So he goes out to Paraguay, and he also sort of gets affected by the atmosphere there and the environment, and he gets sort of increasingly eccentric, and he wears white gloves in the heat of the jungle because he's paranoid about germs and all this sort of stuff. And on his tail is the father of the dead woman artist and writer who went to interview this guy once he was back in Holland, I think it was Holland, in his dotage, and her father interviews him, doesn't get much sort of sense out of him, but as a young girl, as the daughter, she finds these transcripts, and then she becomes sort of hooked on this story. So you've got all these framing devices, which seems to make it oh so sort of clever and refractions within refractions. Unfortunately, the drip drip of clues that she is left posthumously for our protagonist to pick up in order to be able to complete this book, because the book itself isn't yielding its secrets. And one of the clues he finds is that she also wrote a dictionary, which, when put together, like sort of lock and key with this book, sort of locks its arcane lore to some extent and makes it more accessible. So she's leaving these clues like birdseed, and finally he pursues it to a memory palace. Now, a memory palace, if you don't know, is usually a technique to help remember things. So you imagine what's called a house or a palace, all the rooms, and you populate the rooms with decor and things which you attach to the things you want to remember. And this was practiced by Quintilian and I think Cicero. So it's a well-known established technique. I mean, they would have done it for sort of teaching rhetoric and things like that. But a survivor of the Guatemalan revolution, where there were lots of atrocities carried out on citizens, decides the only way to preserve a memory of this is to literally build a memory palace full of triggers and clues for a village that was basically wiped out by the government forces. So our protagonist tracks down this guy in his museum, and you realise this is the end of the journey, that basically he's been summoned not so much to complete this woman's book, but to be taught a lesson, that how important it is to preserve memory when memory has been wiped out by the forces of law and authorities, which is there's nothing wrong with that message at all. But because it's become hooked up within the context of this book with, it's almost like a strop by the woman, that, you know, you left me, you didn't continue the journey, you took the easy route, you went back to university, blah, 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 blah. It's almost like a grudge that she's held for all these years. And bear in mind, they've not been in contact. And now she's punishing him for that in a sort of most petty-minded, trivial relationship way. Yes, it's led him to this important lesson about, you know, we must preserve memory of those who have no voice of their own. And that she's made him be that voice, or at least the conduit of that voice for this museum. But it all seems to have emerged out of petty spite. So this book is not as clever as it pretends to be, and I felt really let down by it. 2 stars. Bit of crime fiction. So I found a few more books recommended to me over Twitter or X than in recent years. And when this one was sort of put up there, I felt compelled to buy it because it sounded like it was a similar theme to my own current work in progress. And I always fall into this trap that whenever I come across something that sounds like what I'm writing, I have to go out and read it and check. And I always remember my debut novel called A, B and E, which is about a gangster's mole who has to flee for her life from her husband. So I heard about this book called Gangsters' Wives. So I went out and bought it, and it was the most drivel dreck. It was absolutely awful. And every time I've sort of allowed myself to be manipulated to, I've got to check out the competition and just see that it's not covering my ground. They never do. And part of the reason they never do is because they're not literary. And I don't know why I keep falling into this trap. And yet again, this book is a million miles removed from mine. It has one literary reference in it, which is to Milo Bender from Catch-22, which I think is quite an obscure reference. Not Catch-22. Everyone knows what Catch-22 is, that, you know, can quote it. But the name Milo Bender, I don't think many people are aware that's the name of the character in Catch-22, and not even the main character, although the main character of perversion, I suppose, of capitalism. Okay, so what's this book about? So a guy spent 5 years in prison doing time for another on behalf of somebody else, because that somebody else is the big crime boss's son. And he did the time in expectation that he would be rewarded when he came out with £500,000. He comes out and the money's not there. The money's not there because the son, who basically he protected, is trying to move in on his father's criminal empire, trying to get his dad to retire and let him take it over. That sort of has echoes with my current work in progress, which I'm not going to talk about. But if you know the film Point Blank with Lee Marvin from 1967, my novel, sort of plot-wise, and only plot-wise, because my novel's dealing with other themes than plot-wise, I very much draw on the structure of Point Blank. This is really an odd piece of writing because there's virtually no character work in it whatsoever. So you've got the crime boss who we meet when our free guy goes to visit him and is told the money isn't there. And then we never hear from the crime boss again, apart from a couple of short phone calls where he's not really prepared to say anything in case they're being listened in on. The son, who is trying to take over, we don't see him until quite late on in the book. We're told he's this terrible man and everything, but there's no evidence of it. I mean, I'm not saying he's a good guy. He isn't a good guy. But there's no personal evidence of it. It's just all hearsay. Plus, you know, the goons that he sends out to track this guy down, we see it in their behaviour. So there's no character work whatsoever. So we've been told that this guy is a badass. And yet, as a plot device, I think at least 3 or 4 times when our hero and the woman are sort of cornered, and the thugs employed by the undercrime boss, the young guy, say, "Come out, we just want to talk." Well, we've been told he's a badass, that you know, he kills anything that moves that's earned his displeasure. No one's going to buy that if they come out they'll talk, put down their guns and talk peaceably. You know, the guys making the offer know it, our protagonist and the girl know it, and we, the reader, know it. It's a completely pointless device, and it's used 3 or 4 times. Come out, we just want to talk. The 2 main characters, the guy who's freed from prison and this woman that he sort of runs into, that she's sort of wrapped up into it, and he rescues her, which is just like Dave Courtney's real life criminal memoir called Stop the World I Want to Get Off. I think that's what it's called. It's a scenario straight out of that. Anyway, this woman, who is notionally, you know, she's not from a criminal background, she's not grown up in gangs and all of that, yet she's so able and so competent that, you know, she can look after, I mean, they work as a team, so she can't look after herself, but actually she more than holds her own when the chips are down and, you know, people are firing at them with guns or tying them up or whatever. She's completely as useful to get out of these situations as he is, which didn't ring true either. And then we have the inevitable, you know, showdown set piece at the end, which was just Blair, seen it all before. This was just terrible. I gave it 2 stars. If half of that was for the Milo Mendebender reference. And finally, to Hanna Stoltenberg's Near Distance. I was a bit bemused by this book. So we have a mid-50s woman who is beholden to no one. She has casual internet sex from dates on the internet. She doesn't, you know, she has a job managing a jewellery store. It's not her store, but, you know, it's just to make money to, you know, pay her way through life. All of that's fair enough. She's very self-possessed. She's not embarrassed by her body. She's very, you know, very liberated in that sense, very sexualised. So it starts off creating a very positive image of this woman, but she's beholden to nobody, including her own daughter, who she very rarely sees. She's quite aloof from the rest of the world. She'd rather just be in her own flat. She has no time for other people. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with all of that. But the daughter's marriage is in trouble when the daughter finds out that her husband is having an affair with a New Age spiritualist teacher. And the daughter is in a terrible state, and she calls on her mother, her sort of long absent mother, and says, look, I need to get away from it all. Can you come with me to London for a week so I'm not on my own? And the mother sort of says, oh, okay, fine, not really knowing what to expect. Anyway, the daughter's slightly hoodwinked her, because the reason she wants to be in London is that the femme fatale, the other woman, is delivering a lecture over there, and she's going over there to sort of confront her. And we get a lot of mother-daughter time together where they're not really in sync. They almost seem to be two different alien species from each other. Perhaps inevitably the daughter rounds on the mother for failing to be much of a mother to her. And then we get the day of this lecture and blah-de-blah-de-blah, and then we get an ending where the focus seems to have switched away from the mother and onto the daughter. And I'm not going to spoil it for you as to how it ends. And that's it. And I just felt I didn't really get much out of this book, I'm afraid. I couldn't really see what it was driving at. She's a very, as I say, a beholden unto no one, which is great, but it means that we can't really get close to her. She certainly wouldn't get close to us. She would have no interest in us, which makes it hard for us to have interest in her. So sort of bizarre, really. I think I gave it 3 stars because it is well written, particularly the beginning, when it's building up this image of a strong, independent woman. You think, right, this is going to take us to interesting places, and it doesn't really. So as I say, 3 stars. And that's it for this week. So till next time, thanks very much.